Mira realized something was wrong the instant she heard a distant wolf howl. The sound echoed through the forest, coarse and unnerving. At first, she resisted believing it, hoping it was just another wild animal roaming the woods. Yet deep down, she recognized the feral cry of rogues, exactly the danger the young man at the river had tried to warn her about. Shame coursed through her. During that fateful moment by the water, the man had shouted something desperately, urging her away from these woods. But she had misunderstood and instead pressed forward into the dense brush. Now she was trapped in rogue territory, a place known to be far more perilous than the transition zone near the Pack Alliance's lands. Fear snaked through every nerve in her body as she pressed herself against the thick trunk of a pine tree. Even her shallow breaths seemed too loud in the tense hush that descended over the forest. Still, she knew she could not remain in one spot for long. Rogues possessed uncanny senses of smell and hearing. They would track her with ease if she hesitated. The second howl rang closer, making Myra's heart pound like a hammer in her chest. If the first had been an alarm, the second was definitely a rallying cry. They were spreading the word. An intruder was in their domain. She needed to flee. Yet she moved gingerly, stepping on stones and patches of moss to muffle her footfalls. Through parted branches, she spotted the silhouette of her pursuers flitting among the trees. Panic warred with reason. Each twig snapping underfoot sounded deafening in her ears. Every rush of wind between branches made her want to run faster. She had heard tales back in the Pack Alliance about how rogues devoured other werewolves. She had tried to discount those stories, imagining them exaggerated. Now, confronted by cold reality, she knew the rumors were likely all true. Another unearthly howl burst through the forest, even nearer this time. Her pulse spiked. They were closing in. Spying a break in the treeline ahead, she bolted toward it, hoping it led somewhere she could hide. But once she reached the clearing, her footsteps skidded to a halt. Loose rocks clattered down an abrupt drop. She found herself on the edge of a cliff. The cliff's ledge jutted out over a deep gorge. One misstep and she would fall to her death. Fear pressed against her ribs. She spun around, searching for another way out, but the rogues had already cut off her retreat. Four of them emerged from the trees, hackles raised, teeth bared, eyes glowing with bloodthirsty intent. Their growls sent a hot surge of dread through her. She staggered back, nearing the brink of the precipice. The ground crumbled beneath her heels, forcing her to lurch forward to keep from tumbling over. The rogues advanced, their savage grins revealing razor-sharp canines. She knew this was the end. With the cliff at her back and the predators in front, she stood no chance. One rogue fainted forward, snapping at her ankles. Mira screamed and spun aside, only to stumble onto a jagged rock. Two more rogues lunged, seizing her by the arms. A jolt of pain flared in her shoulders as they wrenched them back. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. Her mind fought to comprehend the horrifying reality. The forest she once believed held a slim chance of escape had turned into her worst nightmare. She had always feared the rogues, knowing they were driven by primal violence rather than the rules that guided most werewolf packs. Now, staring into their malicious eyes, she saw no mercy. She fought to pull free, but their grip tightened. Claws dug into her skin. Another rogue grabbed her chin, forcing her to stare directly into his twisted face. All hope of evasion faded as they dragged her away from the cliff and deeper into the woods. She kicked, but her captors were far stronger. Each unsuccessful struggle only won sneers and mocking laughter. Eventually, they arrived at a makeshift clearing, an encampment walled off by crumbling wooden fences and tall, jagged rocks. A foul stench saturated the air, and as Mira was shoved inside, she understood its source. Piles of bones lay near the edges, some with bits of flesh clinging to them, others bleached white by sun and rain. Her stomach roiled. More rogues appeared, drawn by the sight of a fresh prisoner. A hush settled across the camp as a tall, scarred figure stepped forward. His right eye was partially clouded over, as though wounded long ago. This man exuded authority. The other rogues cleared a path for him. Such a pretty one, said the scarred rogue in a rasping voice. His lips curled into a cruel approximation of a smile. Might be worth keeping around for a while. A few of the others chuckled, though their eyes never lost that hungry gleam. Myra's body trembled with adrenaline and dread. She tried to keep her composure, but fear pulsed through her veins, making her limbs shake. The scarred leader waved a hand. "Hang her up. Let's have a bit of fun with our new guest." Rough hands shoved her toward a sturdy wooden post in the center of the compound. She squirmed, but it was pointless. Her wrists were bound overhead with coarse rope, the tension so tight her toes barely brushed the ground. The tautness in her shoulders made her gasp in pain, but her pleas for mercy went unanswered. Someone yanked at her clothes, tearing them from her body. Shock and humiliation flooded her as cold night air hit her exposed skin. She was vulnerable and surrounded by hostile faces leering at her. The leader circled, his eyes never leaving her. He snapped his fingers, and two rogues dashed into a low-roofed structure at the edge of the camp. Moments later, they dragged out a half-dead werewolf, a woman battered beyond recognition. She was so gravely injured that her eyes barely registered consciousness. Myra's stomach churned. The battered woman collapsed in the dirt. "Show her," the leader growled, addressing his underlings. The rogues descended upon the helpless werewolf. In a heartbeat, they tore into her, ripping flesh from bone in a frenzied feast. The victim's final screams echoed through the forest, sending Myra's own cry of horror ripping from her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to stop trembling at the gruesome sight. When the rogues finished, nothing remained of the poor werewolf but mangled remains. The leader turned back to Mira, a look of sadistic delight on his face. He trailed a claw down her cheek, smearing fresh blood as he did. "Afraid now?" he asked, the corners of his mouth curving. "Good. A healthy dose of terror and desire can make a slave more compliant." His whip cracked in the air. A long strip of braided leather coiled in his fist. Panic clawed at Myra's throat. Her muscles, already taut from the rope, nearly gave out. She managed only a strangled moan as he raised the whip. Then came the first lash. Fire tore across her back, arching her body in agony. The second strike landed quickly, a sharp crack that forced a scream from her lips. The camp fell into a hush except for the rhythmic snap of the whip and the tortured cries escaping her raw throat. By the time the leader ceased, Myra's body quivered uncontrollably. Blood trickled down her back. Bruises and welts overlapped the lashes, each movement a new wave of torment. The leader flung the whip aside and grabbed her chin again, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Don't die on us too soon," he warned. "I still want to enjoy having you around." She hung limply in her restraints, breath ragged, unable to voice any protest. A swarm of regrets battered her thoughts. If she had stayed in the Pack Alliance, she might have avoided this fate. Yet, even with the pain and humiliation, some part of her refused to surrender to despair. She had survived the Storm Pack's cruelty and found a way to escape. Deep inside, she believed she could do it again. The leader grunted an order, and two rogues began untying her. Her body crashed to the ground, every lash on her back flaring in fresh pain. She whimpered, tears hot against her cheeks. The rope burns on her wrist stung. She blinked, forcing her gaze up to the leader's scarred face. "I'm not finished with you," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet camp. "But you look about done for now. We'll see what tomorrow brings." Summoning what little energy remained, Mira let her eyelids flutter and forced her breathing to hitch. Her chest rose in ragged bursts, emulating a struggle for air. She coughed violently, as though near cardiac arrest. The leader narrowed his good eye, suspicion flickering over his scarred features. "Hey, don't kill her," one of the rogues muttered, crouching down to press an ear to her chest. "She's in really bad shape." The leader gave a low growl, glancing at her with growing frustration. "Fine, put her in the corner. But no one touches her yet. I want the fun for myself." Two rogues dragged her to a cramped space near a stack of broken crates. Even through her feigned delirium, Mira saw a wooden stairwell leading to a basement. The foul stench of rot seeped up from below, thick enough to churn her stomach again. Once they tossed her onto the hard ground, she remained limp, letting her eyes slip shut. Gradually, the camp's focus shifted elsewhere. The rogues returned to their previous activities, some boasting about recent hunts, others gathering around a pit where a fire crackled faintly. Mira lay still as exhaustion and pain weighed her down. Through half-lidded eyes, she monitored them, waiting for a chance to slip away. Time crawled. The moon rose, casting silver light across the clearing. The rogues' raucous chatter dulled into subdued conversation, their earlier excitement replaced by fatigue. One by one, they began to drift to sleep, sprawled around the flickering fire. Her heart pounded as she tested her limbs. Pain roared from every lash mark, but she managed to stifle her whimpers. When at last the camp settled into uneasy slumber, she dared to move. Inch by agonizing inch, she propped herself up. The battered remains of her clothes clung to her, torn and soiled, offering scant protection from the forest chill. From her vantage point near the crates, she saw a single sentry standing at the gate. He leaned on a crude spear, eyelids heavy with sleep. Every so often he jerked upright, forcing himself to stay alert. Mira knew she had to avoid him. Keeping her body low to the ground, she crept behind the crates, each motion igniting fresh waves of pain in her ravaged flesh. She spotted a gap in the rickety fence, maybe large enough for her to slip through. The fence's wood was partially rotted, boards warped with age. Summoning courage, she pressed her body against the loose slats and quietly began to wriggle free. A moment of panic halted her when a rogue behind her stirred, grumbling in his sleep. She froze, holding her breath until he settled again. Then she continued, ignoring the stabs of pain, scraping her torn skin against splinters. More tears stung her eyes, but she refused to make a sound. Finally, she managed to push her body through the gap, tumbling into the undergrowth on the other side. Cool night air filled her lungs, and for a brief second, she allowed herself to hope. She was free of the compound, at least for now. Her wounds ached with every movement, yet adrenaline drove her onward as she limped away, branches scratching her arms. The forest pressed close, oppressive in the dark, but the threat behind those walls was worse. Mira wandered aimlessly, conscious that she had no idea which direction led to safety. She picked her way through the underbrush, stumbling over half-buried roots and rocks. Occasionally, she glanced back, imagining shapes shifting in the shadows. Any sound, a snapping twig, rustling leaves, sent her heart racing. Eventually, faint howls erupted from behind her. The rogues had discovered her absence and were raising the alarm. Fresh terror fueled her muscles, and she staggered into a desperate run. Blood dripped from her open wounds, leaving a faint trail. Though she tried to brush away footprints or scuff leaves over the ground, she knew it was likely pointless. Rogues could sniff her out by smell alone. Frenzied footfalls closed in from different angles. The chase spurred her to push harder, though her limbs felt like lead. Sweat mixed with blood, coating her battered skin, making it impossible to move without excruciating pain. Yet she refused to give up. Find her! A livid voice roared in the distance, echoing through the trees. Mira recognized it as the leader's. I'll tear her to pieces myself. The promise of violence in his words propelled her onward. She scrambled over a cluster of rocks, nearly toppling into a shallow gully. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Every nerve felt on fire, straining, demanding rest. But the memory of what she had witnessed, the savage feeding, the whipping, kindled an iron resolve in her chest. As if in mockery of her efforts, the forest suddenly opened onto a rising ridge. She climbed it, hoping it would grant her a chance to circle around or find a path out. At the top, a steep drop greeted her yet again. This ravine was just as deadly as the first cliff she had encountered. Panic writhed in her gut. She stepped forward, scanning the area desperately for another route. Footfalls pounded behind her. Several rogues burst through the tree-line, their eyes fixated on her with hateful triumph. Their leader emerged last, his scarred face contorted in anger, single good eye blazing with intent. Myra's shoulders sagged in despair. She was trapped yet again. One rogue snarled and lunged, fangs bared, but before his jaws connected, a dark figure slammed into him from the side. The sheer force sent the rogue sprawling across the ground. Another tried to intercept but met a similar fate. A massive wolf sprang into view, knocking him off balance with bone-rattling strength. Myra's eyes widened, heart pounding. The wolf stood protectively in front of her, bristling with fury, teeth bared at the rogues. The beast's powerful shoulders and deadly focus made the pursuers hesitate. For a moment, she was too stunned to register who had come to her rescue. Then recognition dawned. Through the haze of pain and fear, Mira identified the wolf's distinctive markings. It was the same young man from the storm pack, the one who had tried to warn her at the river's edge, the one who had leapt after her when the current swept her away. Somehow he had tracked her here. Relief washed over Mira so profoundly that her knees nearly buckled. The rogues, momentarily shocked by the newcomer's ferocious charge, regrouped with angry snarls. Yet the young man did not back down. He stood between Mira and her hunters, poised to defend her at any cost. In that electric instant, the entire forest seemed to hold its breath. The leader's fury mounted, and the remaining rogues prepared to fight. But the momentum had shifted. Despite everything she had suffered, despite the near certainty of her doom, Mira felt a faint flicker of hope as she recognized the wolf. The storm pack's formidable presence had arrived just when she needed it most, and in that realization, everything changed.